Ethan Carlyle, the 41-year-old millionaire businessman, sat alone in the corner booth of an elegant, high-end restaurant. The atmosphere was quiet but alive with the soft hum of conversation and the gentle clinking of glasses. The scent of gourmet food filled the air, but none of it reached him. He was distracted, his mind elsewhere, lost in thoughts of his past and the weight of the responsibilities that piled up with every new deal. His business partner, across the table, continued his monotonous monologue about expanding into new markets, but Ethan barely heard a word. His eyes wandered across the restaurant, drawn to the flurry of activity around him, but everything seemed muted, as if the world outside the moment had lost its urgency. That was when she walked into his line of sight. A young waitress, no more than 18, approached with a bright smile. She wore a simple uniform, but the way she moved, the grace with which she carried herself, was anything but ordinary. When their eyes met, Ethan froze. The image before him was jarring, as if the past had suddenly reached out to him with cold fingers. The waitress, Emily Anderson, looked strikingly familiar. Too familiar. Her soft, wavy brown hair framed her face, cascading over her shoulders in a way that reminded him of someone he had loved and lost. Her features were delicate, high cheekbones, a perfect nose, and lips that carried a quiet, unspoken sadness. But it was her eyes, the color of deep hazel, that took his breath away. Those were the eyes of his late ex-wife, Vivienne. Maxwell had buried Vivienne's memory deep, a shadow in the corners of his mind. He had tried to move on after her tragic passing, tried to forget the way she had looked at him, the warmth of her smile. But now, as he stared at Emily, it was as though Vivienne had stepped out of the grave and was standing before him once more. His heart skipped a beat, then began to race as he tried to mask the emotions flooding through him. Emily noticed the way he was staring at her. It was uncomfortable, unsettling. But she quickly masked it with professionalism, her voice steady as she asked for his order. Ethan's thoughts were a whirlwind, unable to focus on the simple question. His mind screamed to say something, anything, but instead he could only nod and mutter a distracted order. The whole time, his eyes never left her face. When she left, he couldn't help but feel a strange emptiness, as if the world had shifted beneath him and he was no longer sure of what was real. The encounter with Emily haunted Ethan for days. He couldn't shake the image of her face, the uncanny resemblance to Vivienne. It was more than just physical. There was something about the way she moved, the kindness in her smile, the way she carried herself, that felt like echoes of the woman he had loved. Ethan had lived through so much grief after Vivienne's sudden death. And for the first time in years, it felt as though the past was alive again, knocking at his door. Every evening after work, Ethan found himself returning to the restaurant. It wasn't because he was hungry, but because he needed to see her again. Emily wasn't there every night, but when she was, Ethan couldn't look away. Her presence was magnetic, drawing him in. There was a strange familiarity in the way she interacted with the customers, the way she carried herself. Was it possible she could be connected to Vivienne in some way? One evening, Ethan could no longer contain his curiosity. He caught the manager, a middle-aged man named Gary, when he wasn't busy. His voice was steady, but his heart pounded in his chest. "Gary," he began, his tone casual but purposeful, "I've noticed one of your waitresses, Emily. Could you tell me a little more about her?" Gary raised an eyebrow, surprised by the question. "Emily? She's one of our best. Sweet girl, been with us a few months now." Ethan felt a pang of frustration. That wasn't what he was asking. "No, I mean, do you know anything about her background? Family? Where she's from?" The manager hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Well, her story is a bit unusual if you want to know. She was adopted when she was a baby. No known family. Came from an orphanage, if I remember correctly." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "Adopted? No known family? This was too strange. And what's her last name?" "Harper," Gary replied. Ethan couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something more was at play here. It wasn't just the resemblance. There was a deeper connection he couldn't explain. The information Gary had provided only intensified his need for answers. Why had Emily been adopted? Why was there no record of her biological parents? He left the restaurant that night with more questions than ever. The idea that Emily could be connected to Vivienne in some way was becoming less of a possibility and more of an obsession. The following evening, Ethan sat alone in his penthouse, nursing a glass of expensive whiskey. His thoughts drifted unbidden to Emily. His mind couldn't let go of the idea that somehow she was connected to Vivienne's death. The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. The timing was too precise. Vivienne had passed away only a few months before Emily's birth, a coincidence so exact it felt like fate's cruel joke. Ethan couldn't just sit back and do nothing. He needed to know the truth. There was only one way to get it. The next day, he hired a private investigator. The investigator, a man named Sean, had an efficient air about him. He didn't ask questions or waste time. Within hours, he was diving into Emily's background, searching through old records and conducting interviews with anyone who might have known her. Ethan watched, impatient and anxious, as Sean pieced together the fragments of Emily's life. A week later, Sean returned with a report. As Ethan read through the findings, a chill settled in his bones. Emily's birthday was just months after Vivienne's death. More disturbingly, the report confirmed what Ethan had feared. There was no trace of her biological family. Her adoption records were sealed, her past a complete mystery. Ethan closed the file, his hands trembling. The answers he had been searching for were slipping further out of reach. But the more he learned, the stronger his conviction grew. Emily's life was inexplicably tied to his past. He could feel it in his gut, an undeniable pull that he couldn't ignore. In the darkness of his penthouse, Ethan made a decision. He would confront Emily. He would find out the truth, no matter the cost. Ethan's obsession with Emily had begun to consume him. Each day, he found himself returning to the restaurant, though he rarely ate. Instead, he watched her from across the room, noting the way she moved, the way she smiled at customers, how her voice carried with a warmth that reminded him so much of Vivienne. It was becoming unbearable. The resemblance was no longer just an eerie coincidence. It was haunting, an echo that refused to fade. Days passed, and with each encounter, Ethan grew more anxious, more desperate. He couldn't help but wonder, was it possible that Emily was more than just a doppelganger of his lost love? Was she connected to Vivienne in some way he hadn't yet uncovered? Finally, one evening, he couldn't take it anymore. Emily was serving a table near him, and when she glanced up, their eyes met. She froze, clearly uncomfortable, and Ethan knew that now was the moment to act. He rose from his seat, his heart racing as he walked over to her. Her face betrayed a mix of confusion and apprehension, but he ignored it, his voice low but urgent. "Emily, I need to talk to you." She glanced around, as though unsure of what to do. "Is everything okay, Mr. Carlyle?" "Please, sit with me for a moment," Ethan insisted, his tone soft but firm. Reluctantly, Emily agreed, and they sat across from each other at one of the empty tables. Ethan studied her closely, unable to deny the wave of emotion that flooded him. He had to know the truth. "Emily, I've been coming here for weeks now," he began, his voice steady but filled with tension. "And I can't ignore this anymore. You look exactly like someone I used to know, someone I lost." His throat tightened, but he pressed on. "I need to know if you have any connection to her, to Vivienne." The mention of Vivienne's name made Emily's eyes widen with surprise. "Vivienne?" she repeated, a note of confusion in her voice. "I don't know anyone by that name. I don't know what you're talking about." Ethan's heart sank, but he pressed further. "You were adopted, right? And your family background is..." He caught himself. "Your records are sealed, aren't they?" Emily recoiled, a sharp tension filling the air between them. "I don't know why you're asking me about this," she said, her voice growing defensive. "I'm just trying to live my life. I'm not connected to anyone you knew." Ethan's chest tightened. He couldn't stop now. "Please, I'm not trying to upset you. There's something about you, something I can't explain. I need to know." Emily stood abruptly, her face flushed with emotion. "I don't know what you want from me. I'm not your past, and I'm not your answers." She turned and walked away, leaving Ethan sitting alone at the table. His mind raced with frustration and confusion. How could she be so dismissive? And yet, a nagging feeling told him there was more to Emily's story than she was willing to share. The next few days felt like an endless blur to Ethan. He replayed the conversation with Emily over and over in his mind, each time feeling the sting of her rejection. He had pushed too hard, too fast, and now it seemed like she wanted nothing to do with him. His obsession, his desperate need for answers, had driven her away. The weight of his guilt settled heavily on his chest, but it wasn't enough to quench his thirst for the truth. Despite her reaction, Ethan couldn't let go of the feeling that Emily was somehow linked to Vivienne's death. It wasn't just her appearance, it was the sense of familiarity that lingered in her every movement, her every word. His logical mind screamed that it didn't make sense, that the connection was purely coincidental, but his heart told him otherwise. Meanwhile, Emily was struggling with the aftermath of their encounter. She had returned to her apartment that night, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion. Why had he approached her like that? What did he want from her? She didn't know anything about this woman named Vivienne, nor did she want to be dragged into Ethan's obsession. It was a chapter of her life she had tried to forget, her adoption, her unknown past. Emily couldn't help but feel violated by Ethan's probing questions. The truth of her past was something she had buried deep inside, something she had never sought to uncover. Now, it seemed as though someone was trying to pull that painful truth out of her, whether she was ready for it or not. In the days that followed, Emily avoided Ethan's gaze whenever he came into the restaurant. She focused on her work, her mind preoccupied with the unsettling events that had transpired. But the questions lingered, gnawing at her. Who was this Vivienne, and why was Ethan so convinced they were connected? What had he seen in her that made him believe they were more than strangers? Her rejection of him had been firm, but part of her couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan was hiding something important. Despite her determination to move on, she knew deep down that their story wasn't over yet. As the weeks passed, both Ethan and Emily found themselves at a crossroads. Ethan's obsession with Emily remained unrelenting. He couldn't stop thinking about her, couldn't stop wondering if there was some truth hidden behind the mysterious woman sitting just out of reach. His business empire was still thriving, but his personal life was in shambles. The more he thought about Emily, the more he realized that his search for answers had consumed him, clouding his judgment and his ability to heal. Emily, too, found herself at a crossroads. Her life had been simple before meeting Ethan. She had always kept her head down, focused on work, and buried the painful truth about her past. But now, his questions had opened up old wounds, and she found herself unable to ignore the possibility that her past might be more complicated than she had ever imagined. One evening, as she sat in her apartment, Emily looked through a box of old documents she had never opened, adoption papers, letters, photographs from her childhood. She had never wanted to know too much about her birth parents. But now, after Ethan's accusations and the strange feeling that had taken root in her, she wondered if there was something in those papers that could explain the strange connection between herself and the man who had become obsessed with her. As she sifted through the papers, she found one letter in particular, a letter from her adoptive mother, addressed to her on her 18th birthday. The letter spoke of her origins, of her adoption, and a hint of something darker that had never been revealed. Emily's hand trembled as she read the final sentence. You were born just a few months after Vivienne Carlisle's tragic passing, and you have always been a part of a greater story than you know. Her breath caught in her throat as the words sank in. Who was Vivienne Carlisle, and what did she have to do with Emily's own history? The discovery of the letter shook Emily to her core. For the first time, she felt the weight of a mystery she had never known existed. She couldn't fathom how her adoption, her past, could be connected to someone like Vivienne Carlisle. Emily had always known she was adopted, but her parents had never shared the full details, and she had never asked. The letter's cryptic words stirred something deep within her, and a sense of dread settled over her. There was so much she didn't know, so many unanswered questions. Ethan's words echoed in her mind. You look exactly like her. Now, it seemed as if he had known something she hadn't. The more she thought about it, the more it became clear that the two of them, she and Ethan, shared more than just a passing resemblance. There was a deeper connection, one that neither of them fully understood yet. Emily was determined to find out the truth, even if it meant opening doors she wasn't sure she was ready to face. On the other hand, Ethan's obsession with Emily had reached a boiling point. After weeks of fruitless attempts to get closer to her, he had spent his nights piecing together fragments of his past, Vivienne's death, the adoption, Emily's background. The private investigator had uncovered more than he had bargained for. Emily's adoption had indeed occurred just months after Vivienne's tragic death, and the adoption records contained no mention of any biological family. Ethan couldn't ignore the strange coincidence any longer. He was driven by the need to know, to understand how this young woman could be so intertwined with his lost love's life. He had to find Emily, had to confront her again. This time, though, it would be different. He wouldn't push too hard. He would offer her the answers she needed, and maybe, just maybe, he could find peace. Ethan found Emily the next day at the restaurant, wiping down a table near the corner where she had been standing the day he confronted her. He hesitated before approaching, his mind racing with 1,000 things to say. But when their eyes met, the distance between them seemed to disappear, replaced by the unspoken understanding that this confrontation was inevitable. "Emily," he began, his voice soft, more earnest than before. "I know you don't want to talk to me, but I need you to listen." She stared at him for a long moment, her expression guarded but curious. Slowly she nodded, and he led her to a secluded booth at the back of the restaurant. "I've been digging into your past," he admitted, watching for her reaction. Her face remained unreadable, but he could see a flicker of something. Surprise, fear, or perhaps both. "I know you were adopted, and I know about Vivienne. I didn't want to bring this up, but there's something about you, Emily. I think you're connected to her. You have to be." Emily took a step back, her body stiffening as she crossed her arms. "What are you talking about? I told you already, I don't know anyone named Vivienne." Ethan swallowed, his heart racing. He had hoped for a different response, but this wasn't a surprise. "Vivienne was my wife. She died. But there's something about you that reminds me of her. Your eyes, the way you move, your kindness. I'm not crazy. I know there's a connection. Please, just tell me the truth." Emily's gaze dropped to the floor, and for a moment, the silence between them was thick with tension. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and uncertain. "I didn't ask for this, Ethan. I didn't ask for you to come into my life and stir up all of these questions. I don't know who Vivienne was. But now, after reading that letter, after everything you've said, I don't know what to believe anymore." Ethan's heart clenched. "I never wanted to make you feel like this. I just—" "No," Emily interrupted, her voice trembling with emotion. "You wanted answers, and you thought I was the key. But I don't know if I want to know the answers. I don't know if I'm ready to face what this means." She stood up abruptly, her face flushed with frustration. "I don't need you to fix me, Ethan. I just need to live my life." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Ethan in the booth, a pit of guilt and confusion gnawing at him. He had pushed too far, too fast again. And now it seemed like he had lost any chance of getting the answers he so desperately sought. For the next few days, both Ethan and Emily were engulfed in turmoil. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the confrontation. The rejection stung, but what haunted him most was the uncertainty that still lingered. He had been so certain that Emily was somehow connected to Vivienne. He couldn't shake that feeling. But now, more than ever, he was starting to realize that his own obsession might be clouding his judgment. But Emily wasn't faring much better. She had spent sleepless nights replaying Ethan's words in her mind. The letter, the revelation of her adoption, her eerie resemblance to Vivienne, all of it was too much to ignore. She had to find answers, but she wasn't sure where to start. One evening, Emily received an unexpected call from her adoptive mother. The voice on the other end was familiar, but it held a sense of urgency that made Emily's stomach drop. "Emily," her mother said, "I think it's time we talk. There's something I've been hiding from you for a long time." Emily felt her pulse quicken. "What is it, Mom?" "I think you deserve to know the truth about your birth parents," her mother said, her voice strained. "Vivienne Carlisle was your mother." The words hit Emily like a ton of bricks. She felt the floor beneath her give way, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. "Vivienne Carlisle," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But how? How is that possible?" Her mother sighed, a sound of deep regret. "It's a long story, Emily. But the truth is, Vivienne died before you were born. You were adopted by us shortly after. Your real mother loved you dearly, but circumstances were too difficult for her to keep you." The shock was overwhelming. Emily's mind raced to process what she had just learned. Vivienne Carlyle, the woman Ethan had been mourning for years, was her mother? The very same woman who had captured Ethan's heart? The very same woman he had never been able to let go? She sat down, her hands shaking as she tried her mind around the truth. And as she did, a terrible thought crossed her mind. Could this be the reason Ethan had become so obsessed with her? Could it be that he was searching for a piece of Vivienne, a chance to hold on to her in some form, even if it meant finding her through Emily? In the weeks that followed, Emily and Ethan's lives began to intertwine in unexpected ways. Emily struggled with the truth of her heritage, while Ethan, still reeling from the discovery, couldn't escape the feeling that his search for Vivienne was coming full circle. The pieces were falling into place, but the puzzle seemed more complicated than ever. As Ethan sat in his study one night, going through old papers and photographs of Vivienne, he came across a letter he hadn't read in years. It was from Vivienne, written just before her death. The letter had always been a reminder of the love they had shared, but now it held a deeper significance. With trembling hands, Ethan unfolded the letter and began to read. In it, Vivienne had written about her hopes for their future, her love for him, and her final wishes. "Promise me, Ethan," the letter read, "that you will find peace. Don't let grief define your life. Live on for both of us, and one day, let go of the past." The words struck Ethan like a lightning bolt. He had been so consumed by grief, so fixated on the past, that he had forgotten Vivienne's final plea. As much as he wanted answers, he knew that what he was searching for in Emily, his connection to Vivienne, wasn't the key to healing. Letting go, accepting the unknown, and moving forward were the true steps toward peace. The weight of the revelation that Vivienne was Emily's biological mother continued to hang over both Ethan and Emily, though each grappled with it in their own way. Ethan found himself torn between the past and the future. He had spent years trying to hold on to the memory of Vivienne, but now, faced with the truth, he realized that his obsession had only driven a wedge between him and the healing he so desperately needed. Emily, on the other hand, was left reeling from the new knowledge of her true heritage. She was no longer just an adopted young woman struggling to understand her place in the world. She was the daughter of a woman who had once been Ethan's world. The pain of the past was too much for both of them to carry alone, but they found a subtle yet significant way to bridge the gap between them. One morning, Emily received an unexpected letter. It was from Ethan. At first, she was hesitant to open it, unsure of what to expect. After all, their last conversation had been fraught with tension and confusion. But something pushed her to rip open the envelope. The letter, though short, contained words that shook her deeply. "Emily, I've been thinking about you, about us, and about the things I've put on your shoulders. I know I pushed too hard, and for that, I am truly sorry. I never wanted to make you feel burdened by the past or by my grief. You've shown me something I had forgotten in my own life, the ability to move forward, even when it feels impossible. Please allow me to help you build your future in whatever way I can. No strings attached, just a chance for a new beginning. I've arranged for your tuition to be covered for the next semester, anonymously. I hope this will give you the peace of mind you deserve as you move forward in life." The gesture stunned Emily. Her heart was filled with a mix of confusion, gratitude, and guilt. She wasn't sure how to respond to someone who had given her so much without expecting anything in return. Ethan's words, though simple, had opened a door to a future she hadn't imagined for herself. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of hope. Emily sought him out later that week. When she arrived at the restaurant, Ethan was sitting at the same table, his face filled with the familiar mix of anxiety and hope. She hesitated for a moment before sitting across from him. "Ethan, why did you do that?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. Ethan met her gaze, his expression softening. "I wanted to make things right. You deserve to be able to focus on your future, not worry about finances or anything holding you back. I don't want you to feel like you owe me anything. This is just something I felt I needed to do." Emily stared at him for a long while, processing his words. And for the first time, she understood. Ethan wasn't trying to replace Vivienne in her life. He was offering a hand of compassion, acknowledging the shared pain that connected them, but also recognizing that they both deserved the chance to heal in their own way. She couldn't deny the sincerity in his gesture, and in that moment, she realized that maybe their paths had crossed for a reason. "Thank you, Ethan," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm not sure I'm ready for all of this, but I appreciate what you did. More than you know." Days turned into weeks, and both Emily and Ethan began to embrace their new realities. Ethan, though still haunted by the past, had come to terms with the fact that he needed to let go of his attachment to Vivian's memory in order to move forward. He started investing more of his time in philanthropic efforts, working to create opportunities for young women who faced similar struggles as Emily. He found purpose in helping others heal, knowing that his actions, though born from a place of pain, could spark positive change in the world. Emily, meanwhile, took her first steps toward reclaiming her life. The financial burden that had once weighed heavily on her shoulders was lifted, allowing her to focus on her studies and her future. She enrolled in a new program and began working part-time at the restaurant again, finding a sense of independence and pride in her accomplishments. She knew that her past was something she couldn't change, but it didn't have to define her. One afternoon, months later, Ethan sat in a cafe just outside the city, a place he frequented to escape the bustle of his high-powered life. He had recently completed a major philanthropic project, one that would provide scholarships for young women from disadvantaged backgrounds. As he sipped his coffee, a figure walked into the cafe, and for a brief moment, his heart skipped a beat. It was Emily. She had changed, grown more confident, more self-assured, and in that moment, Ethan realized how much she had blossomed in the time since their last meeting. She was no longer the shy, uncertain young woman who had been unsure of her place in the world. She had found her voice and her purpose. "Emily," he called out, smiling warmly as she approached. She smiled back, a genuine bright smile that lit up her face. "Ethan," she greeted him, sitting down across from him. "I've been meaning to thank you again. Everything has changed for me, and I'm finally starting to see the future with hope." Ethan nodded, proud of the progress she had made. "I'm glad. You deserve all of it, Emily." They sat together, talking about their lives, their hopes, and their future. For the first time, there was no weight of the past between them, only the potential of what lay ahead. Emily had found her footing, and Ethan, though still haunted by his memories, was finally starting to find peace in his new purpose. Their conversation shifted, and Ethan asked the question that had been on his mind for a while. "Have you thought about what you want to do with your life? Where you see yourself in the future?" Emily took a deep breath, smiling softly as she answered. "I don't have it all figured out, but I know one thing for sure. I want to help others, just like you helped me. I want to create opportunities for people who feel like they have no chance. I've been given a second chance, and I want to pay it forward." Ethan's heart swelled with pride. Emily had found her calling, and in doing so, she had shown him that healing could come in many forms. It wasn't about solving mysteries or clinging to the past. It was about moving forward, together. The charity gala was a night of reflection, a night of healing for everyone in the room. As Ethan stood in front of the crowd, addressing a group of young women whose futures were now brighter thanks to the scholarships he had funded, he couldn't help but think back to the journey that had brought him here. It had been a long road, filled with pain, regret, and unanswered questions, but it had also been a journey of discovery, growth, and, ultimately, healing. Ethan looked out into the audience, his eyes finding Emily among the crowd. She was standing near the back, watching him with a quiet smile. She had come a long way from the unsure young woman he had first met, and now she was poised to make a difference in the world. For the first time in years, Ethan felt at peace. He had let go of the past, and in doing so, he had allowed himself to embrace the future. The mystery of Vivian's death and Emily's connection to her had been a catalyst for change, but it was the compassion, the understanding, and the willingness to move forward that had ultimately led to their healing. As Ethan finished his speech and walked off the stage, Emily approached him. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence, the quiet understanding between them, spoke volumes. They had both found peace in different ways, and they had both found healing. not through answers, but through the acceptance of the unknown. Together, they had discovered that the greatest gift of all was the opportunity to move forward and to help others do the same. The night ended with a sense of closure, but also with the promise of new beginnings for both of them. Their journey was far from over, but they had taken the first steps toward a brighter future, and for that, they were both grateful. In the end, it wasn't the answers that mattered. It wasn't the search for connections or the unraveling of mysteries that brought healing. It was the courage to move forward, to accept the past as it was, and to embrace the unknown with hope. Ethan and Emily had both walked through a storm of grief and confusion, but in their shared journey, they discovered the quiet strength that comes from letting go. They had learned that healing wasn't about finding closure in the past, but in building something new from the lessons learned. As the charity gala came to a close, the two of them stood side by side, no longer bound by the weight of the past, but uplifted by the promise of a future full of possibilities. They had found peace, not by solving every question, but by choosing to create a life defined by compassion, purpose, and the shared desire to help others. The story wasn't about a reunion, or an untold secret, or even a tragic loss. It was about the human capacity for change, the resilience of the heart, and the unwavering power of kindness. And as they walked into the night together, they knew that no matter what came next, they would face it not alone, but with the strength of their own healing and the support of each other. Their story, like life itself, wasn't over. It was just beginning. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story and watch the video. I truly appreciate your support, and I hope you enjoyed every moment of the journey we've shared together. If you liked what you saw, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, and be sure to subscribe for more content like this. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions mean the world and help me continue to create stories that connect and inspire. Thank you again, and I look forward to sharing more with you soon.